encourages people's spirits of the abundance to share something special with the child that is in Africa. And that's why today I am joined by Julianna Lindsey, who is UNICEF's country representative to Rwanda, of course, to discuss this day and to tell us the status of not only the African child, but also the African child in Rwanda and where we stand. Thank you very much, Julianna, for making time to be with us, and welcome to the
Thank you. It's really a pleasure.
So this year's theme states access to a child-friendly justice system in Africa. You know, my first question will be, how just is our system today to the children?
It's a really good question, and I must say Rwanda's made amazing progress in this area and put some really innovative and effective programs in place to deal with justice for children. I'll give you just a couple of examples. One is the one-stop centers, which are for children and also women who have experienced domestic violence, gender-based violence, sexual assault. What's really good about these centers is that they bring together the health services, the police services, the justice services, the psychosocial services, because when you've been through this type of experience, you don't want to have to run to 3 or 4 different places. You want to deal with people who have special training on how to ask questions sensitively, on how to do the proper health checks. And I'm really impressed that while 10 years ago, 2 of these centers were piloted by the government together with several UN agencies, actually, Unicef, UNFPA, UN Women, but today there are 44 across the country. So in any district in the country, there is the opportunity to get this kind of specialized support.
Absolutely. Then would you say the children with disability, do you believe they also feel part and parcel of this justice system that's in place?
Slowly but surely. You know, it depends, of course, on the type of disability that we're talking about. But there are gradual efforts to make sure that all children can benefit from these types of services. One really interesting method that's underway now is putting together a particular postgraduate diploma on child justice, so that all of the justice professionals in the country will have this extra training. And it brings in exactly these kinds of issues, making sure that all children, regardless of their physical or mental circumstances, have the same type of protection from the justice system.
Absolutely. Now let's look at the fact that we are in a pandemic and children are back home where normally they would be in school. You know, this is a time where parents, some are saying it's a bit hard for them. You know, how has it been for UNICEF in trying to engage the children in this particular time?
It's a good point, and it's something as a parent also we're all worried about. I'm really happy that the Rwanda Education Board, together with UNICEF and several NGOs, put in place immediately the radio lessons. And they've reached about 3 million children so far. Also those children who do have internet access, and I realize it's not as many as we would like, but certainly those who do are able to access the lessons online. So even though it's worrisome that children are not having that social interaction, they're not having the direct instruction from the teacher for the next several months, at least there are really good mechanisms put in place to make sure that children can continue to have their education.
Absolutely. Now, out of every 1,000 births in Rwanda, around 50 of these children do not survive to see their 5th birthday. But for every 100,000 mothers who give birth, around 210 do not survive as well. How has this been changing over the years, you know, and what has been done to ensure, you know, mortality, you know, the issue that is being dealt with?
Yeah, I mean, this is really the base issue of child survival, right? We can't help children if they don't live. The progress has really been phenomenal. You know, back in 2000, 20 years ago, 200 out of every 1,000 children did not live to see their 5th birthday. And today it's 50. So that's a dramatic reduction in 20 years' time. The really interesting thing about this 50 is that most of the children who die before their 5th birthday are actually not 3 or 4 years old. It's actually very often in that first month of life. So it's been quite important for us to work together with the hospitals, with RBC, with the Ministry of Health, to put in place special mechanisms of training nurses, training doctors, so that they know how to treat the children and that they have the equipment to treat the little babies, particularly when they're born prematurely. You know, if they're not born at 9 months, but at 8, at 7, at 6 months, they need particularly special care. So that quality of care care is really important. The other thing that's really critical is making sure that children, as they get older, of course, get their vaccinations, that they are visited in their homes by community health workers, that when they're sick, their parents take them to get the treatment that they need at a health facility. And we have been seeing really strong vaccination numbers in Rwanda over the last several years. I know there were reports recently in the news, worries about the budget and will the vaccines be covered. The government, I believe, is presenting the final budget to Parliament today, and so that's something that I know the parliamentarians will be looking at. But the Ministry of Health has made so much progress in this area. I can't imagine that Rwanda would not continue to fund the vaccines. That's such a critical area.
Absolutely. I think another important bit in early childhood, of course, is the ECDs, which, of course, you, the Unicef, of course, and the government of Rwanda helped launch even the very first ones. How successful has it been so far since the very first one was launched?
Well, there are different aspects of this. One place in particular where early childhood development centers have been set up is in the markets.
Yes.
It started just with one, and now there are 4 centers in markets that reach almost 700 children. What's really interesting about these is that often, you know, the moms would go to the market to sell things, but the children are running around not having proper supervision. And when a mother can take her child to the center, she knows that the child is safe, she knows the child is protected, she knows the child is getting a nutritious meal that day. And perhaps most importantly, she knows that the child is getting stimulation. Now, what do I mean by that? When I was a new mom, you know, made no sense to me. But essentially what it means is making sure that the child has songs sung to it, stories read to the child or stories told to the child, that the children play together because they learn social interaction that way, that they play with toys, they see colors, they see shapes. If they're a little bit older, they start to learn their numbers and their letters. And we see, particularly in our work with early learning, with reading, together with USAID and also with VSO, we see that children who have early learning opportunities, they start to learn, not, you know, reading whole pages, but they start to learn their letters, they start to recognize sounds. And there was a really interesting evaluation done of that program that showed that children who had that early learning, early reading opportunity, once they got to primary 1 and primary 2, they actually did better in tests that they administered to the children versus children who were in primary 1 and primary 2 but did not have the early learning opportunity.
How early is early? Is it 6 months? Is it?
Good question. It is never too early. I'll tell you, I remember when I was first a mother, we were living in Ghana in West Africa, and I came home one day, my daughter was maybe 6 months old, and our nanny was reading stories to her. And I thought, you know, she's 6 months, right? But my nanny was right. She was hearing those words, she was seeing the colors and the shapes and the pictures on the page. And there are actually studies from other countries that show that the more words a child hears when the child is really young, the better the child will do in school later on. And even the more income the child will earn later on when the child is a grown-up. So it's incredible what these small things have to do with the development of the brain.
Because right now I'm thinking of the parents who are looking at us and wondering, well, so 6 months, am I too late if the baby is 1 year?
It's not too late.
It's not too late.
No, it's never too late.
I know you've launched a book, My Hero, you know. Why was this important for you to launch this particular book, especially for the children this particular time?
Right. Well, this book is especially about COVID, the disease that we're dealing with and worried about right now. It tells the story of a little girl who wakes up with a dragon that carries her all around the world, sending messages to different countries about hand washing, about social distancing. I see we've got more than a meter between us, about wearing your mask if you're outside or in public. And it's a really nice way to tell children the story. It gives them a sense not of powerlessness, of, oh my gosh, this disease is going to take over, but rather it gives them a sense of what they can actually do to make sure that they stay healthy, that their friends stay healthy, that their families stay healthy. And I'm especially excited that it's now been translated into Kinyarwanda. So it will be much more accessible to the general population in the country.
So far, Where can they get it? Online?
It's going to be broadcast, actually. It's going to be read by a grandmother.
Oh, wow,
Yeah.
That's interesting. I'm sure we'll be looking forward to it. Now, let's talk about chronic malnutrition.
Yeah.
So far, I know it has always been an issue in the country, but we've seen a decline. At least 38% of the children, however, are still stunted, even though we have the decline. What more needs to be done? Where are we not doing right? Where are we going wrong?
Well, first, a lot is going right. Perhaps the most important thing is that the government, including the president himself, have recognized and focused on this issue. And I really commend the government and the people of Rwanda for that. Now, there are still a couple things that need to be done in order to get this number down, because 38% is still really high. I do want to point out that there's some real inequities in this number. When we look, for example, at the rural-urban divide, around 40% of children in rural areas are malnourished, only about 20 or 25% in urban areas. So that tells us something about where we need to focus. The second real inequity is between poor families and better-off families. When we look at economic groups, the bottom 20% are stunted. The top 20%, about 20% of the children are stunted. So again, it tells us where we need to focus, on the poorest families and on the rural areas. Now, there are really good programs that have already been put in place. The eggs at the ECD centers, the milk at the ECD centers, the micronutrient powders are all really important steps forward. But I actually want to share what Dr. Anita, who runs the national ECD program, said to me a couple of weeks ago. She said, you know, we have to get animal protein into these children. So at the end of the day, it's about children having the right food to eat, but it's also about water and sanitation. Because, and forgive me here for being a little sensitive, but when children have diarrhea, the nutrients go out of them. So it's very important that children have clean water to drink, not just from the tap, but actually in the household. And also equally important that children have access to latrines and be taught how to use a latrine properly, that they wash their hands afterwards, etc., so that they don't have diarrhea and they can actually keep the good nutrients in them.
But I'm looking at it in the aspect of 1,000 days, because they say it's before you're even born that a parent should, you know.
You're right.
Where do they strike the balance then? Is it the parent who, you know, who's pregnant, a pregnant mother should start eating well?
Yes.
And then it grows on and on?
Exactly. That's very true. Very true. So it also comes in when the woman goes for antenatal care, making sure that she gets the proper treatment, making sure that if she has anemia, for example, that she get the proper nutrition that she needs, etc.
Absolutely. And that means that besides the milk, we also need to have a balanced diet.
We do. We need vegetables, we need fruit, we need a little bit of meat, etc.
Now, Rwanda, of course, has one of the fastest growing economies in Central Africa, and of course was one of the few countries to achieve all the MDGs. However, according to the Unicef reports that I read, 25% of the children between the ages of 5 and 14 experience multi-dimensional poverty, deprived of the basic needs, at least in 3 different areas. What does this even mean before we go into these 3 different areas?
Very good question. So basically, when we look at poverty, typically we think of money, right? How much does the family earn? What can they buy with that money? Can they buy nutritious food? This idea, which is not just a UNICEF idea, but also one that's subscribed to by UNDP, by the African Union, etc., is that there are different types of poverty. Part of it is income, but part of it is access to nutritious food. Part of it is being able to go to a good quality school. Part of it is housing. Part of it is water and sanitation, etc. So in Rwanda, and a number of other countries as well, UNICEF sat together with the National Institute of Statistics, and we identified which of these dimensions, we call them, are most important for children. So poor in money, but also poor or wealthy in food, in housing, in education. What's interesting is that different types of poverty in different age groups. So the young children under the age of 2, their poverty is more in the area of malnutrition. The children between the ages of 5 and 14, the area where they have most poverty is actually water and sanitation. And the teenagers, it's in access to secondary school, because we know that all teenagers, unfortunately, do not yet go to secondary school. One of the interesting things about this is when we break down the children who live in the different types of poverty by their home experiences, we find that children who live in poverty tend to have parents or caregivers with the lowest levels of education. They tend to be in rural areas, again, and they tend to be more in female-headed households. So again, particularly this issue of education, it points us to the need to make sure that as many children as possible can get not just through primary school, but all the way through secondary school. And that when they come out of secondary school, they really have the learning, the knowledge that they can use to earn more money and take better care of their children.
You know, you've brought in an aspect of education, you've brought in an aspect of the involvement of the parents, especially the fathers.
Yes.
We have an issue where you see, you know, the child, that's the mother's problem, you know. I should not be dealing with the children. I should be, you know, focusing on getting the money for the family and stuff. How important is it for a father to be part and parcel of the growth of a child?
Absolutely critical. And this is not an issue just here in Rwanda, by the way. Also in other countries where I've worked, even in my own country, we see that men's and women's involvement in raising children is different, and women tend to take the greater burden. But there are a couple of things I would mention with respect to fathers. First, it's not fair to the fathers if they miss out on raising their children, right? When we talk to fathers who actually are engaged with their children, they realize how much fulfillment, how much joy they receive from that. And so it's really not fair to the fathers to miss out on that. We also see that fathers transmit information, guidance, knowledge, wisdom to children in a different way than mothers do. And we need both, right? The 13, 14, 15-year-old boy may need both the guidance and the wisdom from the father and the guidance and the wisdom from the mother. So it's really important that fathers be involved at all stages.
From childbirth.
Absolutely. I'm very proud that my husband actually did the first nappy changing of our daughter. I was rather incapacitated, mind you, but he took over. I was really impressed.
And he did a good job.
He did. He went with me together to the classes to learn, and he just stepped right in there and did it.
So of course it is a challenge to the fathers out there who feel, you know, it is the mother's role, you know, to do everything for the child. But let's go back to the child rights. Exactly what rights does a child have? Because a child cannot talk. A child can only cry, yet we all struggle to understand what they're trying to say.
Right.
So basically, what are their rights?
Right. The rights stem from the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which Rwanda has signed and ratified and is also codified in Rwandan legislation. There's a really important concept in the convention called evolving capacities. And basically it means, as you say, that, you know, a little baby has the right to health care, the right to life, etc. It may not yet need the right to education. The 3-week-old may not yet need the right to play because it's still, you know, hardly moving. But as the child gets older, then more and more rights become relevant. So, for example, the right to have an opinion, the right to have a say in what happens to the child, that may not apply when the child is 3 years. But by the time the child is 15, for example, if there's, let's say, a divorce custody case, the judge should absolutely listen to the child's preference about where the child wants to go, who the child wants to live with.
Now, I'm looking at it because in an African child perspective, most of the African children, you know, we can't get as loud or we can't speak as much as we need to speak to. So basically, this is a right that's been taken away from the children?
Well, you know, different societies look at this in different ways. It's also why it's important that in Africa we also have the role of the parents, specifically recognizes the role of the community, and brings these issues into bear along with the rights that children have in the Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Now, the girl child.
Yes.
You know, a girl child either has not gone to school, you know, because in the African concept of some African countries, they believe a girl should be at home to cook, you know, look after their siblings and stuff like that, which of course has been an issue, and of course cases of early marriages, you know, that has been an issue too. What are the numbers in the country? Do we have such cases in Rwanda so far?
You know, luckily in Rwanda, we do have legislation that says that one cannot get married until one is 21. We do have the surveys run by the Rwandan government, like the Demographic and Health Survey, which showed that around 14% get married in some form or fashion, cohabiting perhaps, before they are actually 18. And so that is something to look at. We know both from Rwanda and also from other countries around the world that one of the biggest ways of preventing early marriage, for girls especially, is of course education. And so the longer girls are in school, if we can get them all the way through secondary school, the chances of them actually getting married before they're 18 drop dramatically.
Wow. But then this also affects in African regions, conflict areas, you know, the girl child. How well should they be protected, and who comes to speak for them in cases of the child rights?
Well, in any area, it's important that those of us who have power, whether it's United Nations, whether it's government, journalists have power in talking about public issues. It's important that we put out to the public the situation that children are living with. It's important that we give children a voice, that we help them have information about what's happening. I'll give you an example. In Rwanda, we mentioned the budget earlier. And one of the things we've done together with the local organization CLADO is, and of course with the Ministry of Finance, is once the budget is approved by Parliament, educating young people about it in the schools. Because the more they know about how government works, the more they know about the priorities that government has set, they start to learn to ask questions. They start to learn to interrogate the budget itself, and it prepares them then for later on as adults when they perhaps themselves are members of Parliament or part of the staff of the Ministry of Finance.
Absolutely. Maybe before I let you go, let's look at global challenge, the African continent as a challenge. What would you say are the 3 top challenges that children face in the African continent, and what would be your advice to, say, policymakers or to parents or to whoever has a child, to help them to have a better life or to have an African child that is in a better way of living today?
So first I would say I want to see Africa as an opportunity, not as just a challenge.
Yes.
There are challenges that we deal with, of course. One is employment, preparing children for employment once they get past that age of 18, because we see very high unemployment rates in many countries. Rwanda's luckily is not as high as in some other countries. In Botswana, where I lived before, for young people it was around 40%. In South Africa, it's even higher. So we're quite lucky in Rwanda, actually. But we need to prepare children when they're teenagers to have the skills that they need in order to step into the workforce later on. Second is malnutrition. We see this not just in Rwanda, but in countries around the continent. And this is important. It actually links to the employment issue. This is important because the brain development takes place in part related to malnutrition. And of course, the more the brain develops, the better one does in school, and the more one can contribute actually to the economy later on. And a third area, unfortunately, that we see in many countries is violence against children. There are different forms of violence. Sometimes it's sexual violence. Sometimes it's beating children. Sometimes it's bullying children against children. This isn't always about adults, right? Sometimes children are cruel to each other.
Absolutely.
So these are 3 things that we need to keep our eyes on. There are also 3 things that governments around the continent, together with the African Union, are working to address. So we just have to keep pushing forward and supporting the governments to deal with these issues.
Maybe because they're being pushed and saying, so the last 3 advice then you can give to parents who are watching today, because you have said it is important to ensure that a child has proper meals. You have said it is important to engage a child and give them toys, read to them, sing to them. Then what would be your last advice? Because today we have the African child, we're celebrating the Day of the African Child. We're in Africa today because some of these things, we tend to watch them in movies and we tend to exaggerating. But in real sense, these are things that are very important to us. Then what would be your advice to the parents watching us today when it comes to upbringing of the children?
Yeah, thank you. Well, it feels a little bit presumptuous, but I'll tell you what I've learned from others. First, the toys don't have to be fancy, expensive toys. Even just games in the sand with sticks and rocks and leaves can stimulate a child's brain. So we don't have to be, intimidated and feel that it's got to be the big fancy things. Secondly, simply love. Children need love, they need to be comforted, they need to be paid attention to. And that's hard right now for parents with all of the stresses of worrying about money with impact on the economy. In some cases, everybody together at home and just being stressed out by so much close contact. But we need to remember, and I tell myself this, I need to give my daughter extra hugs. We need to pay extra attention to our children because that gives them an important feeling of value, of worth, and it helps them then as they go forward in life.
Well, thank you very much, Juliana, for making time to be with us.
Thank you. Really an honor. Thank you.
Well, of course, thank you to all our viewers who have made time to join you. And do remember, it is the Day of the African Child. Give your child an extra hug today. Show them that you care and you love them. My name is Fiona Babazi. Do keep it the big Q.